mode.
I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of 360 Thought Leadership Consulting and Webinar Program Manager for Global FP&A Trends. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, Beyond Budgeting from Managing to Enabling Performance. We are thrilled to have FP&A professionals from over 30 countries registered for our webinar today. A budget is often a strategic anchor rather than a tool that facilitates effective decision making. Success in today's world means innovative management models that release people from staffing bureaucracy and suffocating controls and trusting them with information and empowering them to think, reflect, share, learn, and improve. Today, Beata Boxness, Senior Advisor Performance Framework, Statoil, and Chairman Beyond Budgeting Roundtable will share how Statoil has embraced the Beyond Budgeting principles to develop an ambition to action model. This model has allowed them to redefine performance with a dynamic and relative holistic performance evaluation, leverage dynamic forecasting, and resource allocation to eliminate traditional budgets and empower event-driven as opposed to calendar-driven decision-making across the enterprise. Before I welcome our featured speakers to the webinar, I'm going to offer a few quick words about the FP&A Trends Group, FP&A Trends webinars, and then cover a few housekeeping items and our agenda for you for the valuable time you've chosen to invest with us today. A few words about the FP&A Trends Group. Featured piece is in-person and online education, International FP&A Board. We're now in 15 cities, 11 countries, and 4 continents. Just made some great inroads to our initial meetings in the United States. Online FP&A resource, fantastic resources, blogs, thought leadership, the global FP&A webinars like we have today, also FP&A strategic and consultancy research. Just a few quick words about our webinar. We want to share our content across the globe with thought leaders across the world, and we only deliver one webinar a month in order to have strict control over the quality of the webinars that we share. A few housekeeping items. We'll send you the links via email to the presentation and the recording within the next 48 hours. We'd like to hear from you. You can ask your questions in the questions area at your GoToWebinar control panel for the Q&A session at the tail end of the webinar. If we do not get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of our webinar, as we always strive to improve the ROI we offer our event attendees for their valuable time. Quick few words about our agenda. We're going to start off. Larissa Melnichuk is going to start us off with a little bit about some key definitions and concepts, and then we're going to welcome Beata. It's a great case study from Statoil, and then we're going to wrap things up with some conclusions and recommendations. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome our featured speakers to the webinar, Beata Boxness and Larissa Melnichuk. Beata has a long international career both in finance and HR. He's heading up the implementation of Beyond Budgeting at Statoil, Scandinavia's largest company. He's chairman of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. Obviously, he's a very popular international world-renowned speaker, is the winner of the Harvard Business Review McKinley Management Innovation Award. He's also the author of Implementing Beyond Budgeting, Unlocking the Performance Potential, where he writes about his 20 years long Beyond Budgeting journey. Statoil has opened up for Beata to undertake select consulting work. Larissa Melnichuk is a founder and managing director of FP&A Trends. FP&A Trends helps companies realize their innovative FP&A potential through training, consulting, professionals, and networking. She's an experienced practitioner with several senior level positions, and of course, she's run the International FP&A Board. It's a global and well-recognized FP&A best practices think tank. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to hand the floor over to Larissa. Larissa, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Ernie, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. So excited to have our third global webinar this year, and so excited to hear that we have registrations from over 30 countries around the globe. Today we have a very interesting subject, the subject of Beyond Budgeting. And I would like to start this quick introduction from the top 5 trends and challenges that we see around the globe for financial planning and analytics. Obviously, simplification and driver-based planning and data and analytics and integrated planning, strategic business partnering, these are the trends. But as you can see, the challenges, one of the biggest challenge at the moment. This is traditional budgeting culture. We had beyond budgeting discussions in many countries around the globe. This is the subject that is extremely popular at the moment, and obviously all those innovations and analytical transformations, very often they have problems with this traditional budgeting culture. So if we look at the next slide, obviously the main advantage of this distinctive management philosophy is that this is much more adaptable process. It's much more adaptable than our traditional budgeting process. And also it allows for flexible planning and decision-making process as well. So if financial planning and analytics should be flexible and dynamic and should happen almost immediately, the process of reforecasting and scenario planning and decision-making, it's very difficult to do this in traditional budgeting environment around the globe. The biggest challenges that we see during our FP&A board discussions, people say that the first challenge, obviously, this is communication to city analysts, to Wall Street analysts, and as usually such communications are based on budget. And the second one, people always ask what to do for sales organizations when they have these fixed budgets, fixed targets that are agreed during the budgeting process. So obviously those are the top limitations that still drive a lot of traditional budgeting processes around the globe. As Ernie already mentioned, we are very lucky today. So we have classic of Beyond Budgeting and a thought leader and author today, Bjarta Bognes. Bjarta is Senior Advisor of Performance Framework in Statoil company, one of the biggest oil companies that is based in Norway. And also Bjarta is the only person in the world who introduced Beyond Budgeting to two organizations, not one, but two organizations. Bjarta, it's such a pleasure to have you today. I would like to give you the floor for your presentation on the case study in your company. You're welcome.
Larissa, thank you very much. And hi, everybody. It's good to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation from the FP&A board to talk about something I think is important, namely beyond budgeting. As you heard, I work for a company that is called Statoil. That is, we used to be called Statoil because only a few days ago we changed our name into Equinor. And there's a meaning in that name. It's inspired by equality, equilibrium, but also our Nordic roots. So what I would like to share with you today is first the bad news, the case for change, the problems with traditional management, including budgeting. Then I want to share with you what beyond budgeting really is, because it is about more than budgets. It is about business agility. And then I want to finish off with the Statoil implementation. Our journey started back in 2005, so 13 years ago, and we have been going ever since. I'd like to continue with a quote from a wise person, Peter Drucker. Most of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job, and I would very much agree. This label performance management, which I actually don't like. If we don't manage performance, there will be no performance, is what we think. I don't think that's true. I will come back to why. But beyond budgeting has definitely something to do with budgets also. And I want to share with you my budget problem list. Why is this process so problematic and so flawed? And as you can see, it's a pretty long list. I'm starting off with what a lot of people regard as the biggest problem, a very time-consuming process. I wouldn't agree. I think there are some much bigger problems on the list, but it does belong here. Assumptions quickly outdated. Budgeting can stimulate unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the internal negotiations, that is not what we would like to see in our organizations. And here's another serious problem. It can create illusions of control. Control is an interesting word, by the way, but if we don't have control, it's better to acknowledge it and act accordingly, and think that we have it and act accordingly. Budgeting often leads to decisions being made too early. We have to make all these decisions about what to do and what to spend in the autumn the year before, too early. And very often it leads to these decisions being made too high up in organizations. Doesn't always improve decisions. We sometimes seem to forget that the budget, it guarantees that we get the cost level that we have budgeted or planned, but it does not guarantee that we get the revenue level that we have budgeted or planned. Budgets can prevent us from doing stuff we should have done. We can't because it's not in the budget, but also the other way around. It can lead us to do things we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. You know the game. Then we have a problem which I don't know how big it is, but it's a bit funny at least. I call it the accordion forecasting horizon. You know, when finance people make budgets, and by the way, I'm a finance guy myself, when budgets are made, we want to understand 12 months ahead, all of next year. Into next year, first quarter, suddenly 9 months is enough. We can still see till year end. Mid-year, 6 months is enough, and then 3 months is enough, before we suddenly get interested in 12 months again, because it's budget time. Not the biggest problem, but at least a bit funny. The last one is not funny. To define good performance as hitting the budget numbers is a very narrow, mechanical, and a sometimes completely outdated language for describing what is good performance. We need a richer, broader, and more intelligent language for describing performance. And I'm sure that all of you listening there will recognize a lot of these problems, and maybe all of them. But maybe you regard these problems as some kind of irritating itches and not symptoms of a bigger problem or a more serious disease. But that is exactly what these problems are. They are symptoms of a very serious problem, which is also a paradox, because this process was invented roughly 100 years ago with the best of intentions, trying to help organizations to perform to their full potential. It was management innovation at the time, and it probably worked 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, but no longer today, because today things have changed. The world has changed. There's a lot more VUCA out there, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. But things have also changed inside organizations with the quality of people. We have the knowledge worker. We have highly educated people who no longer accept to be micromanaged in the way that traditional budgeting very often implies. So the paradox is that this process meant to help organizations perform better is today doing the opposite. It has become a barrier for organizations performing to their full potential. And that, my friends, is a big problem. And I use the word performance. That is an important word, defined in the right way. And I want to talk about that important word for a few minutes in a slightly different setting than business. As you can see, we have now moved into traffic, because in traffic, we would also like to experience good performance, a safe and good flow. That is at least what I want to experience. And I actually think traffic authorities want the same, even if I have my doubts from time to time. Two questions around the traffic light. Who is in control here? And based on which information? And the one who is actually in control here, the one who manages, the one who makes decisions, is the one who programmed this light. Because this is the good old-fashioned traffic light. There are no sensors, no high-tech. So the programmer is the one in control. And where would that person be as you sit there waiting for the green light? Somewhere else. Which information would this programming be based on? It would be based on some historical trends, maybe some forecasts about how traffic can develop, but it would not be entirely fresh information as you sit there waiting. So here we have a management model where the one who is managing is absent and information is somewhat outdated. But again, the best of intentions. Fortunately, we have an alternative to the traffic light. A very different solution, same purpose, the roundabout. Traffic circle, or whatever you want. Same questions, very different answers. Who is in control here? Well, we are as drivers. And based on which information do we take decisions? We take decisions based on here and now, fresh, real-time information. So very different answers to the same question. So it could be interesting to compare a bit more these two ways of managing. So let's do that. And here is a few leading questions to you. First of all, which is most efficient of these two? Well, it's actually been proven that normally the roundabout is more efficient than the traffic light. Which is most difficult to drive in? Of course, it's the roundabout. It takes more competence in a broad sense. And just like in organizations, all the stuff that we are trying to leave behind, the traditional management stuff, is from a leadership point of view, I would argue, much easier than what we are trying to move towards, what we are trying to do instead at Statoil. And forgive me for still calling the company Statoil. I will do that throughout the presentation. The name change is a bit fresh. Last question, is it relevant to talk about values in this setting of traffic? In our organization, we talk a lot about values-based management. And the opposite, we can maybe call rules-based management. And a traffic light is a good example of rules-based management. Red is stop, drive is green, we can always discuss yellow. But beyond that, very simple rules-based system. And if there is a value set among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest. That mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light. But in the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest can actually be a big problem. Because here we are much more dependent on everybody having a shared positive purpose, wish of wanting this to flow well. We have to help each other. We have to interpret each other's intentions. We have to interact with people in a very different way. So values-based is another key word here, and two other key words before we leave traffic. First, trust. Ahead of that light, we are not really trusted to make decisions by traffic authorities. In the roundabout, they trust us to make decisions. The other important word is transparency. In order to make your decision in front of that light, drive or stop, the only thing you in theory need to see is the color of the light. In the roundabout, you need much more transparency. You need to see everything in order to make your decision. So trust and transparency, two important words. And here are another important aspect here. I mentioned that I'm not too fond of the label performance management. It's a very negative label, I think, but it definitely fits with the traffic light. That is exactly what traffic authorities are doing. They are managing performance very actively. The roundabout, however, is about something different. That is about creating conditions for great performance to take place. It's about enabling performance and not managing performance. And that is more than playing with words. These are two very different ways of thinking about these important issues. And some of the words I have just talked about, transparency, trust, autonomy, and so on, you will find in the beyond budgeting principles. Because beyond budgeting is not just about the management processes that you see on the right-hand side. It's also about leadership, as shown here on the left-hand side. Purpose, values, transparency, autonomy. We don't have very strong views on how to organize, but those four words I just mentioned are very important here. And on the management process side, you can see some examples of what we recommend throughout an entire performance process. The rhythm it is run on, how you set targets, how you plan and forecast, how you allocate resources, how you evaluate performance, and how you reward performance. A few important words on these principles before we continue. First of all, these are principles. This is not a management recipe. These principles give guidance, inspiration, but what they should mean in an organization depends on that organization's business, culture, history. And that is the way it should be. I don't like management recipes because in a management recipe, somebody has done all the thinking for you. Your only job is to implement other people's thinking. I find that quite boring and quite dangerous. So if you like to think for yourself, there's a lot of good news in implementing beyond budgeting. Another important aspect here is coherence, consistency between what we preach on the left-hand side, what we practice on the right-hand side. And let me share with you two classical examples of the opposite, lack of coherence, that we often find in organizations. It doesn't help that we on the left-hand side talk loud and warm about how fantastic people we have on board. And we would be nothing without you. And we trust you so much, but not that much. Moving to the management processes, principle 10 here, cutting out the travel budget. Are you crazy? I mean, right or wrong when it comes to travel budgets. I'm just saying that this represents poisonous gaps between what we preach and what we practice. Another classical gap here, it doesn't help that we talk equally loud and warm about we and us and together and team and everybody in the same boat on the left-hand side. If we on the right-hand side, principle 12, if incentives is about nothing than individual bonus, then there is a serious inconsistency between what we preach and what we practice. A number of companies is today on a beyond budgeting journey in some form or shape, and here you see some of them. And I could have talked for the rest of the day about fantastic management innovation taking place in these organizations. Some have come very far, some have just started. They are as such at different stages on the journey, but there is a number of interesting stories here. We don't have the time, so I'm going to limit myself to two examples before we move on. If you can go back to the previous slide, please. If you go, yeah, that one, thank you. Let's start in Norway. On the left-hand side, upper left-hand corner, there's a company called Miles. It's a Norwegian IT company based in Norway, a business in India as well. No budgets, no targets, no nothing. Just a lot of great performance, fantastic results. Miles, again, no budget, no targets, but they have a process which is very important, and that is recruitment. The simple philosophy is that if we get it right at recruitment, if we get the right people on board, the rest follows. So when Miles interview candidates, they never take less than 10 references. And during that interview, management only address the candidates' values, beliefs, and attitudes. They don't talk IT at all. They leave testing of IT skills to employees already on board. They can test for the IT skills. And by the way, they have a veto right. Doesn't matter what management is saying, they have a veto right. It's an IT company, so your PC is an important piece of equipment, and it's important to maintain your competence through courses and seminars. If you work for Miles, you can buy whatever PC you want, as expensive as you want, and replace it as often as you want. You can attend whatever seminar, course, conference you want, as often as you want, wherever in the world. No travel budgets, no training budgets. The only thing Miles require is that when you have bought that PC, when you have returned from that training, you have to post on the internet what you did and the cost of it. So transparency, one of the beyond budgeting principles, is their key control mechanism on costs. And they are very happy with this mechanism. They have no plans of replacing it, but they do have a small concern. It's not a big concern, but a small concern. And that concern is not about, could this mechanism be too soft? It's the other way around. Could this mechanism be too effective? Are people buying good enough PCs? Are they taking enough training? But I would call that a luxury problem. Isn't it nicer to encourage somebody to buy a better PC, take more training, than to bang them on the head with a budget and say, no, no, no. A final, so that is Miles. I want to share with you quickly another great story here before we move on. And some of you might have heard about it. It's the pioneer within the Beyond Budgeting movement, a Swedish bank that you find on top of the slide. It's called Handelsbanken. 850 branches in different places in Europe. It's the fastest growing bank in the UK. Handelsbanken, again, no budgets, no targets, no individual bonuses, no nothing of what we typically call traditional management. But what they do have is a lot of great performance. They started out already back in 1970, and they have been performing better than the average of its competitors every single year since 1972. Handelsbanken is among the most cost-effective universal banks in Europe, and the bank has never needed a bailout from the authorities because they messed it up. It can't be a coincidence, such a continued, sustainable, great performance over so many years and a radically different management model. A lot of transparency, a lot of autonomy are the key elements in this model. A strong belief in the local branch as the key driver of performance in the bank. Handelsbanken was, as some other companies, actually inspired the Beyond Budgeting principles that we saw on the previous slide. So these principles were kind of growing up or coming out of organizations and people like us who rebelled against the traditional way of leading and managing. This did not come from academia. It did not come from the consulting business, although they are all very interested in Beyond Budgeting these days, which are good news, by the way. When we started out in Statoil in 2005, we were actually a bit careful with showing these principles too widely because they can scare people. So we started out, today it's not an issue. I do a lot of internal leadership training. That slide is always with me. But when we started out, we chose to start out in a slightly different place. Or not different, but in a less scary place, more logical. Asking ourselves a very simple question: why do we budget? And if you ask yourself that question, why do you have budgets in your own organization, you might end up with the same answer as we did, namely that the budget has three different purposes. We use the budget to set targets, financial targets, sales targets, production targets. At the same time, those budgets shall serve as that budget shall serve as a forecast of what next year could look like in terms of cash flows and financial capacity. We want to understand what lies ahead. And last but not least, the budget is a resource allocation mechanism, handing out bags of money to the organization on OPEX and on CAPEX. It might seem very efficient to do all these three things in one process, resulting in one number. But here lies also the problem. Let me give an example. Let's assume that we want to understand what lies ahead in terms of cash flows, financial capacity. That is important for us. So we ask our salespeople, what's your best sales budget for next year, so that we can understand the revenue side. But everybody knows that that sales budget proposal will come back as a sales target. And maybe there's a sales bonus linked to hitting that sales target. And we all know what happens with the level of the numbers that then are shipped upstairs. They tend to come down. We also need to understand the cost, OPEX, CAPEX side. So we ask the same people, other people, what is your best cost or invest CAPEX forecast for next year? But everybody knows that this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And last year, my number was cut with 30%. Well, that might also do something with the numbers shipped upstairs, and they tend to go the other way up. This is a problem, not just because it destroys the quality of our numbers, but it also introduces or stimulates behaviors that are at least borderline unethical. The lowballing, the gaming, the internal negotiations. That is not what we want to achieve. Fortunately, there's a very simple solution. In our company, we still do all these three things, but in three separate processes, as you can see in the middle of this slide, because these are different things. A target is what we want to happen. A forecast is what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not, brutally honest, expected outcome. And resource allocation is about optimizing scarce resources in order to make it happen. And this can become different numbers because these are different things. And the beauty of separation is that then we can start to improve each of these processes in ways not possible when it was all bundled into one number and one process. We can start to have great discussions about how can we set better targets that inspire us and stretch people without feeling stretched, which are more robust against the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, and the ambiguity out there. We can start to design better, more intelligent forecasting process, a rolling forecasting process, a dynamic forecasting process. We don't need a million details, this is forecasting, but processes that are more unbiased than what you see in a typical budget process. And last but not least, how can we manage costs in a different way than what you see in a typical budget? And let me give you the headlines of what this could mean in practice on resource allocation, the third purpose, because that is what people struggle the most with. And in our model, we distinguish between how we manage CAPEX projects and how we manage OPEX, operating cost. On CAPEX, we have no detailed annual investment budget. Instead, the bank is open 12 months a year, all year. You can always apply for approval for a project. How high you need to go depends on the mandate structure. Yes or no depends on two things. How good is your project against the criteria we have, and can we afford it as things look today? And that information is coming out of our dynamic forecasting model. When it comes to operating cost, we have a range of alternative tools that can be anything from an overall burn rate guiding, operate at an activity level that in money represents around 1 million, 10 million, 100 million. Within that, you have the full freedom to take your own decisions. It could be a unit cost target. You can spend more if you produce more, a benchmark unit cost target. It could be nothing at all, actually. No budget, no target, but a model where you provide guidance through messages, more videos, less travel, but the only numbers you have are the accounting numbers coming out of the accounting system. And here we would look at trends. If a trend starts to look a bit strange, we would investigate. Very often there is a good business reason for why it looks like this. But, and this is important, we might also come across managers who consciously or unconsciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. In our company, it has happened, it will happen again. The simple thing to do, but the wrong thing to do, is to put everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. The right thing to do, which takes a little bit more leadership, is to take that very firm talk with those involved and let it have the necessary consequences. This is not about being soft. It's about not putting everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. And finally, how can we do all of this more event-driven, more business-driven, and less calendar-driven? This is a nice way to get started on a beyond budgeting journey, because these questions, these discussions can take you in through the back door to the bigger beyond budgeting principles. What is it that really motivates the knowledge worker? Do we need detailed travel budgets if we say we trust people, and so on and so on? And we can also tell scared people who say that it's unthinkable to stop budgeting. we can tell these people that we haven't stopped doing what the budget tried to do for us, but because we have separated, we can do each of those three things in much better ways. How scary is that? So, a great way to get started. Let me give you one example of what VUCA robust targets can be. Let me show you an example of the main financial targets at Statoil. And as you can see, we define performance in relative terms. We are thinking football here. This is the league table that we are playing in. And we have no targets about scoring 49 goals and get 32 points. It's all about doing well against competition. And these two metrics, they also drive the common bonus scheme we have in the company. And of course, you might say that if you look at return on capital, this is less precise than setting a target of 12.5% return. But that is correct, but it's 10 times more relevant. And these targets are VUCA robust. Doesn't matter if the oil price is high or low, because everybody's in the same situation. And we call these evergreen targets because we have more or less had the same targets now for 13 years. We don't need a big operation every autumn in order to calculate new ones. So it's very lean. Most of our league tables are internal and not external. It could be platforms in the North Sea, benchmarked, and so on. So this is an example of what you can do when you have separated the three purposes. Let's move towards the end here to the process where it all comes together at Statoil, Equinor. Ambition to action. Three purposes: translating strategy, managing risk. We introduced or included risk management in the process. It's about securing agility, and it's about activating what we say about people and values in our company. It starts with translating strategy into strategic objectives. Then we address risks. Then we identify actions needed to take us towards those objectives or to address risk. And very often that could be one and the same thing, so it lies in the same database. Then we have indicators measuring that we are moving towards those objectives. But we are emphasizing that these are indicators. They are not necessarily telling the full truth, and I'll come back to what that means in practice. Then a translation over into what this means for you and me. So here we're into the HR process. And a very important principle at our company is that what you deliver is as important, how you deliver is as important as what you deliver. And with how we deliver, we talk about the values in this book, in the what we have, which you call the Statoil book, or now the Equinor book. It's a small little booklet spelling out who we are, what we believe in. So what you see here is an integrated process running all the way from strategy via risk, finance into HR. Integrated, seamless, coherent. If we go to the next slide, that's an example of what an ambition to action look like. This is actually a screenshot from the system where this is kept, and you recognize the 4 first steps on the previous slide, and then the HR process would follow on the right-hand side. And we've got 5 perspectives, where the first 4 ones are all the things we need to do well and perform well on in order to make sure that we create value as described in the 5th and lowest perspective at the bottom. Today we have around 800 of these ambition to actions, and I will use this slide to quickly share with you 2 other areas where we try to be different. The first issue has to do with alignment. How do you create the red strategic thread throughout? There is a very simple way, which is the wrong way. It's called top-down cascading. The reason we don't do that is that that very easily destroys everything around involvement, commitment, motivation in all those teams. If everything is imposed on you from above, that involvement, commitment, motivation has a tendency to walk out the door. So what we do instead is what we call translation. Each team here would translate relevant ambition to actions around them when they shall make their own. They would look 1 level up, maybe further up, maybe all the way to corporate left and right, and have a deep and good discussion. What does our ambition to action need to look like to support those around us? If such a translation should go wrong, of course the team involved should do what they are paid for, but the reason that is not the problem is probably transparency, because except for share sensitive and confidential information, all of these ambition to actions are open, accessible for all employees. There's no place to hide with a stupid ambition to action. Also, it's not mandatory to have one. These teams choose for themselves. We want these teams to perceive ambition to action as something that is mainly here to help them to manage their own business. If that works well, it works well for the company as such. The other area we try to be different on has to do with time. We used to have annual versions of ambition to action, so every autumn these teams made a new one for next year. It wasn't the budget process, much better, but still an annual process. What we now do is something which is much more dynamic and continuous and business driven. All these teams can in principle change whatever they want on their own ambition to action when something happens in their own business environment, which they think justify an update of their ambition to action. They can change objectives if strategy change. They can change KPIs, indicators, if objectives change or if they find better KPIs. They can even change their KPI targets if these targets have lost their meaning. Impossible to achieve or piece of cake. But it isn't an anarchy. We have a very simple control mechanism. If you want to change something that's big, you still need to seek approval one level up. Approval does not mean a signature. It does not mean a stamp. It simply means that you need to talk to someone. If your change is small, you just inform to the same level at a suitable time. Big or small, always make sure that you inform others affected by your changes. So it's a very simple, self-regulating management model. And again, you have the inspiration from the roundabout. The less we need to do from corporate, the better it is. The more this can run by itself, the better it is. We shall, of course, intervene if needed, support if needed, but self-regulation is an important word. Two other areas where we are trying to get out of the calendar year. Targets. Why should all targets have a deadline of end of December? I mean, we know why, but it still doesn't make sense. So we want natural time horizons. If there's urgency, put 3 months. If it's more complex, put 18 months. We haven't banned end of December deadlines, but it should be more the exception than the rule. The other area we try to run more dynamically is forecasting. A lot of organizations going beyond budgeting introduce rolling forecasting, typically updating your forecast every quarter, looking 5 quarters ahead, 6 quarters ahead. That is fine, but it's also a fixed frequency and a fixed time horizon. We found such a big variety in the business rhythms across the company that we went for what we call dynamic forecasting. So there's no predefined frequency, no predefined time horizon. These teams update their own forecast when stuff happens, which they think justify a forecast update. It all goes into a common database. We have a global SAP solution. And from corporate, we can tap into this information whenever we need it on corporate level. So dynamic. This does not mean that we can get out of the calendar year in all settings. We are not fundamentalist. We are saying do this more event-driven, business-driven, where it makes sense and where it's possible. Let me finish off with another important element in our model, a holistic performance evaluation. And holistic means 2 things here. First of all, the 50-50 between what we deliver and how we deliver. But holistic also means that when we shall evaluate what we have delivered in business terms, which is, by the way, defined by ambition to action, as you see on the screen here, that exercise cannot just be about adding up the number of red and green KPIs. That is too simple, too narrow. And we need to remember that the I in KPI stands for indicator. They are not necessarily telling the full truth. There is actually a reason why they are not called KPTs, key performance truths. They are called key performance indicators. We might start with measuring on KPIs, but since they are indicators, we need to take off the measurement glasses and look at what measurement didn't pick up through these simple questions. I see that your KPI is green, but have we really moved towards those strategic objectives when we look at hindsight insights, all the things that we know afterwards? How ambitious were those targets? Has there been significant tailwind, headwind, changes in assumptions? Which risks were taken? And have what you delivered, is it really sustainable? It's only when we have been through those questions that we have a good enough view on what kind of performance this was. This used to end up in a rating on a 1 to 5 scale in both dimensions. Fortunately, we have skipped that a few months ago, and I'm very happy because I never liked that one. But there is still a more assessment-based link to development plans and rewards. So that was holistic performance evaluation. And this was basically what I had planned to cover with you today. I have a slide here with some contact details. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, highly appreciated. Check out the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, a global network involved in these important issues. You're more than welcome at one of our meetings. And last but not least, this was the very short story. If you're interested in the long version, this is my book, Implementing Beyond Budgeting, about my journey throughout these 20 years. I've been trying to read the book I wanted to write the book that I wanted to read myself. And if you want to read even more, there are some other good books out there on the next slide, which I would also recommend you to check out. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Beata, for your fantastic content and your insights. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our Q&A session. I just want to remind everyone that we can go ahead and take your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. We have just an outstanding opportunity to tap the knowledge of Beata, of course, and Larissa as well, who interacts with hundreds or maybe thousands of FP&A professionals across the globe. So we would certainly appreciate your questions, and I encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity. So first question, Beata, obviously one of the things Beyond Budgeting involves is a huge cultural change. Can you offer us some advice and maybe some lessons learned on how you were able to manage that change and how you continue to manage that culture?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is not a project and it's not a quick fix. It's a long journey and it takes time. But you can change culture and behaviors in an organization by changing your management processes. That is why this interplay between management processes and leadership in the 12 Beyond Budgeting principles are so critical. And you can get into the good spiral of doing changes in your management process, being very vocal about why you do it, taking away the travel budget because you trust people, and you will see that most people actually live up to that trust, even if there might be exceptions. That might lead you to do more, and you get into a good circle. But again, it's not a quick fix and not necessarily a big bang, especially not on the culture side. So you have to be patient.
Okay, fantastic. Beata, let me go ahead and ask you another question, then I'll bring Larissa in for a question, a couple questions around this, which we often find. And it's about where a company would start. So they're on a traditional annual budget process and they're interested in starting this journey. What are a few things that you suggest, the steps, low-hanging fruit, where to look for guidance?
Well, I would definitely pull up the budget problem list and to remind executives about how flawed this process is, and they will recognize most of those problems. Because you need to build a case for change. The other thing you can do is to point to all the other companies out there who today are embarking on a Beyond Budgeting journey, and then you can ask yourself, do you want to be a leader or a laggard in this area, because this is going to happen. And the way to get started, as I mentioned, is can be that separation of budget purposes. It's logical, not scary, but a great way to get started. And there is guidance to be picked from books written from the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. If anyone is interested, there is definitely support and guidance to be provided.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and launch a polling question for our audience as we ask our next question to Larissa. Appreciate everyone's consideration in answering our polling questions here today. Larissa, as you go across the globe and you talk about Beyond Budgeting, and as that concept comes up, what do you see are the key points of any resistance that you're seeing from folks, and what are the biggest barriers do you think to companies from changing this philosophy?
Obviously, this is the cultural barrier. This is the biggest one. Budget has been so much embedded in the culture of many companies around the globe. And when everybody understands that the budget doesn't work anymore, that it's very inefficient and very political and very dysfunctional process, but at the same time, it's almost like very difficult to change at once, and very often it comes from the change of management. It comes from the top very often, but sometimes I also see how analytical transformations can change the culture as well. So the biggest one is the culture. The second one, I would say, this is this traditional way how people set targets, you know, so especially in sales organizations, they can't imagine how they live without it. And the third one, this is the communication to city analysts, to Wall Street analysts. Again, in order to communicate the results of the companies, they need some sort of budget, they need some sort of targets. And companies don't know how to overcome it. So this is from my point of view. I hope I answered.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a quick note, our first polling question was asking folks to characterize their budgeting process. We had over 54% painful or extremely painful, 30% somewhat painful. So hopefully we're going to have some motivation here to take a look at that cultural change in the Beyond Budgeting process. Beata, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Larissa. Can you kind of define the roles? Now we're starting to hear more in projects of this nature. It's a transformation and ongoing transformation of business partnering versus technology. So would you say, Beata, that the partnering comes first and then technology follows that to enable that? Or how do you see the roles of those two interplaying and the importance of those?
Well, first I'd like to say that our Beyond Budgeting journey has really changed the finance role, the controller role in our company towards becoming much more of a business partner with a much higher standard, much more broader, more forward-looking, and so on. And of course, technology has helped on this. We have, as I mentioned, a global SAP solution which provides transparency, one version of the truth, but this is still, technology is not the most critical issue. It's call it necessary but not sufficient. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That's kind of the message that I think we're finally starting to see come out, and obviously some of our colleagues are starting the Business Partnering Institute, so we're glad to see that. Larissa, what are your thoughts on the area of business partnering and versus technology?
I would say that both support each other, you know, but everything starts from the culture. In order to have a good business partnering model, obviously the culture should be ready for this, yeah? But technology is such a great enabler for good business partnering. For example, for FP&A business partnering, to have a great technological routine for your planning and forecasting process, it really helps. But also it helps when FP&A business partners go to business and they investigate, they research, they find out the key drivers for the models, and they educate people as well. So this is the process of learning for both parties. So I would say that it's difficult to say who is the first. Probably this is both ways. Technology influenced the quality of business partnering. Business partnering influenced the technology. But on the top of this is the culture.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and launch another polling question here. As I ask a question to Beata, and I think you covered this, but I'd like to cover it again because this topic often comes up when people try and move just from traditional static budgeting to a dynamic environment. So one of the biggest challenges is abandoning budget and sales organization where the culture is based on the fixed target and those incentives. So can you share with us your practical recommendations on how to adjust the bonuses and incentives in the beyond budgeting environment?
Well, I would make that into an issue of discussing both bonus and targets,
Okay.
because both are problematic. And if you start with targets, I mean, what we really want to achieve, what we really are after, whether we are in sales or in any other part of the organization, is the best possible performance given the circumstances. That is what we're after. Setting targets is one way of achieving it. It's not the only way, and it's not always the best way. And as you just heard, two great companies out there have fantastic performance without targets. And when you have cracked that one, then the issue of individual bonus, well, you can still have it, but then it should be much more assessment-based, or you can do what these two organizations have done. They have moved to a common bonus scheme because everybody is in the same boat. You know, the sales role is often hailed as this kind of cowboy out there fighting on his own and so on. But you know, maybe that great sale today was the result of great back office work last week on that previous sale. So it all hangs together. So I'm heavily, as we are in Beyond Budgeting, we are heavily against individual bonuses in knowledge organizations for knowledge work. And we have also discussions about, can you sometimes do without all those targets that we set.
Okay, fantastic. In order to be mindful of our time, I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question of Beata. And those of you who didn't get to your questions, we'll do our best to follow up with you in a timely manner. So obviously, you've been in this beyond budgeting world a long time, Beata. So can you share with us what you are seeing as new developments or things that might be changing with the principles, and then, or is it just a matter of educating more companies? So what's changing and what's next in this area?
Yeah. Well, if you look at Beyond Budgeting itself, the principles, I mean, they have remained pretty constant since they were developed in the late 90s. There's been a few updates, but it's more or less the same philosophy. So the changes we are seeing, the development is around all the companies that are embarking on this journey. I mean, it's simply exploding these days. We get the requests to speak, to do workshops from all over the world, and something is happening. And some people might call this business agility, which is basically Beyond Budgeting is about business agility, and that is what is happening in business world today. Business agility will be the big thing moving forward.
All right, thank you very much. With that, I'm going to go ahead and formally close our Q&A session. I would like to once again thank Beata and Larissa for your tremendous insight. So thank you both very much. Just a reminder to the audience members, you have the opportunity to request to be connected with either or both of our great speakers in the post-webinar survey, which will launch immediately after my closing comments, which are, finally, to you, the audience, thank you so much for your valuable time today. We hope to see you in person in an upcoming International FP&A Board Roundtable and on our next Global FP&A webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Make the rest of your day great.
Thank you so much, Ernie. Thank you so much, Beata. And thanks so much to all the participants. So see you next time.